But tell me just from curiosity's sake, something about Remo Douglass.
One of the
Did you
most
know him?
brilliant men you would ever meet. He only used one law clerk. He had a second law clerk, but he used that law clerk, I think, to help him write books. And Douglass was in constant motion. You know, he wasted a minute. He had something productive to do every minute. And he was so smart, he would write an opinion, and then while in Justice Black's office, we might go over that opinion through 15 drafts. We would have a comma draft where we went through to see if we could figure a way to get rid of commas. Judge thought commas messed up the English language. And shortened sentences. And then we had one draft. Justice Black never wanted to write quotable quotes. He had a feeling that in the past judges had written decisions and included colorful words that got established as rules of law, when he wanted you to have to read his entire opinion in one piece and look at the whole thing, not be able to pick out a quotable quote. Of course, he did write some quotable quotes, but he really intentionally did not want to do that. And but Douglass would just, I think he'd do maybe 2 drafts and out it goes. And so some of his writing is, while he was a wonderful writer, an experienced writer, a professional writer, I think some of his opinions are a little unfinished compared to what we did. And of course, his personal life was complicated. I think he married 3 times. But he was an interesting, but sort of taciturn. He came to dinner. When I lived with the judge, these other judges would come to dinner, so I'd get to spend evenings with other members of the court, in effect. Which was a wonderful educational program, really unbelievable. But Douglass was sort of taciturn. He didn't talk a lot.
Yeah. He wrote I believe it's a small volume entitled Points of Rebellion. That
I'm not familiar with that book.
Yeah, that many of the young and ambitious revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s looked at very favorably. And I always wondered what kind of individual he was.
Well, he was a very, it's sort of interesting. You saw him, he was sort of a cold personality, except with people that knew him real, real well. I think, but at the same time, he was a very warm person and very conscious of the problems of people and the complications of life. You know, he wrote the Security Exchange Act. He was the head of the SEC. Very complex organizational structure. There was no limits to his mental capacities, but he also had a very, very warm. I understand after he retired, he tried to come back on the court. He got upset, but he wanted to have his say.
Right.
But he made mistakes like everybody else. I think some of their early cases following Brown, particularly the Richmond case, where instead of treating the county as a whole with respect to racial segregation, they held the proper thing was to have a separate city school system, separate county school system. And in the Detroit case, where the judge made his desegregation order to cover all the suburban schools as well as the Detroit schools, and the Supreme Court overruled that and set a pattern that really, in effect, condemned all cities in the United States to be poor blacks in the core and the wealthier whites living in suburbs around it. But Birmingham's not inconsistent with that.
How long were you in D.C. and when did you return to Birmingham?
Well, I went there probably in early '52 in the Army, and I spent a year in the Army and a year with the judge, and I came to Birmingham in the fall of 1954, probably August 1954, with the law firm of White, Bradley, A. Randall, and Rose, now Bradley, A. Randall.
So you were actually back in Birmingham doing the Montgomery bus boycott.
Oh, yes.
Did you have any dealings with anyone that was associated with the bus boycott at the time?
Not at that time. Justice Black's sister-in-law, Mrs. Clifford Durr, I knew her. Right. And I later became, and I knew but didn't know anything about what he was doing, Robert Hughes, young Methodist minister, that Bishop Claire Purcell had appointed, given a special appointment to the Alabama Council on Human Relations. He and I had been students at the university at the same time and gone to work through the Wesley Foundation program at the university. And he went to seminary and I went to law school. He came to Birmingham shortly after the bus boycott and contacted me. And for several years I worked very closely with Bob. I couldn't do public legal work and he knew that. But I ended up on the board of the Alabama Council and spent many weekends meeting at Alabama State. We held meetings. Dr. Gomillion of Tuskegee was on our board, and delightful, wonderful man. Joe Lowry was on our board. He had a Methodist church at that time in Mobile. He had earlier been the pastor at St. Paul's in Birmingham, I think. He wasn't as active. Reverend Wilson was a minister at St. Paul's. I spent many hours with him. He later was the chaplain at Tuskegee.
What board was this?
The board of the Alabama Council on Human Relations. When the NAACP was outlawed, we became virtually the only biracial group in Alabama. And Arthur Shores, John and Deanie Drew, I knew them well.
Was this one of the organizations that sort of filled the void left by the NAACP? Did you look at it in that manner?
No, I don't look at it in that manner. I think Reverend Shuttlesworth's
Alabama
Christian Movement of Human Rights more nearly filled, and of course the NAACP Legal Research continued to work with that group. We mainly were communicators. We met and we puzzled. And I would say in 1959, 1960, by that time we had somewhat concluded that it was going to be very difficult to make social change in Alabama until you got the power structure to take that as a program. And I worked with
the business of the political side?
The business side.
Okay.
You know, the political side simply reflects things. Very little is created in the political side of things. First I worked with, I can't remember the minister's name right now. He's in Brooklyn now, I think. But Oliver, Reverend Oliver. There was a project that I worked with him on. He would, every time there was a police brutality incident that he heard about, he would go and take affidavits from the people that were involved. And I would reproduce those. We had a mailing list, and we sent about 50 top business people in Birmingham copies of those affidavits every time we had one. And the thinking was that people that lived in Mountain Brook and over the mountain would come to work and go home, and they really didn't know much about segregation. And they didn't know what was going on in their city. And we wanted to make sure they knew what was going on. What effect that had, I do not know. I think the most critical thing that happened that turned things around was the Freedom Riders coming to Birmingham. the bus being burned in Anniston, the other bus coming on to Birmingham, Connor refusing to give police protection to the Freedom Riders, and his minister, who's still living, I think was at City Hall personally pleading with Connor to provide police protection. And Connor said they're looking for trouble, they're going to find it. And when I was mayor, I checked the radio tapes, and there was a good 5 minutes between the time the first report came in on the police radio and the time any policeman appeared at the scene. And probably things had been going on for 5 or so minutes before that. But you had this group of thugs meet that bus and beat up the people that got off the bus. And they also beat up people that were simply waiting for a bus. People that had nothing to do with the Freedom Riders got beaten up just because they happened to be at the bus station. And for some reason, the national news people thought that the bus was coming to the Greyhound station. And instead it came to the Trailway station. And Tom Langford, who's still a photographer at the Birmingham Post-Herald, took the pictures of the meeting. And one of the smarter Klansmen grabbed his camera, and he knew about cameras. It's the lens that makes the picture, so he broke the lens and threw away the camera, and of course the pictures were all inside, undisturbed by his action. And the camera was recovered from a trash can, I think, in the alley. And the Post-Herald was a Scripps Howard paper, and he immediately put that on the wire. And it was on the front page of newspapers all around the world. The city had been very defensive when other people came in and criticized us, whether it be Harrison Salisbury or CBS News or any writers that came through. But this time, their own people were beaten up. Clancy Lake, newsman from WAPI television, was beaten up. I think they broke the windshield in his car. He was parked outside. And that picture ran, I say, around the world. And at that particular time, they were having the International Rotary Convention in Tokyo, Japan. And the incoming chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, Sidney Smyer, was there with his group, and they looked at that picture. And they said, you know, we can't take this anymore. And so Connor's action really stimulated the business community to start figuring, how can we get rid of this guy? And they came back and they formed a committee. It was a secret committee. They called themselves the Senior Citizens. It was made up of top CEOs from Birmingham businesses, partners from big law firms. One of our partners was a member, but not active. And bankers. And they started planning. And one thing they saw was that if they could change the form of city government, that might be a way to get rid of Connor. And they asked the Birmingham Bar Association to make a study of what kind of government would be best for Birmingham. And they were pushed on somewhat in that in the fall of '61, the federal judge, Judge Grooms, entered the order requiring the desegregation of Birmingham parks. And the commission immediately said close the parks, and it sent a message to the Birmingham Park Board to close the parks. Former Mayor Jimmy Morgan had been appointed to the Park Board, and he didn't get on the Park Board to close the parks, he got on the Park Board to build a zoo. And the Park Board defied the commission which had appointed them. And that was one of the most interesting things that happened. It was very rare for a city agency to stand up and just face down the commission. But the commission had to handle the Alabama law required them to appropriate $50,000 a year to the parks. And that's an old law when $50,000 was a lot more money. But the rest of their money was budgeted by the city. And so when the park board wouldn't close the parks, they repealed the budget of the park board and forced them to fire all their employees. And I'm told that they had concrete poured down the holes on the city golf courses so nobody could sneak on and play a game of golf. The Bar Association made the study, and in February of '62 they recommended a change to American Council of Government. But they also recommended about 3 or 4 amendments to the law. And if you'd followed their plan, you couldn't have had a change in city government for 2 or 3 years probably. And I frankly thought you couldn't get, the legislature wasn't going to make changes if they were choosing sides, because Alabama politics for many years has run on what I call the law of enemies. If you don't make any enemies, you can get reelected. If you make enemies, you can't get reelected. And so the less a public official does, the less people he makes mad. I don't know, they say that one member of the legislature served 5 terms, never introduced a bill, left the floor at every controversial vote, and got reelected 5 times because he didn't make anybody mad, didn't do anything to make anybody mad. Didn't do anything to make anybody proud of him either, but